Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to explore the life and, maybe more importantly, the ideas of Christopher Langan. He's often cited as having, well, one of the highest IQs ever measured.
Right, and our main source here is a pretty detailed YouTube interview with him that came out recently. It gives a lot of insight into his thinking.
Exactly. So our mission for you, listening, is to try and pull out some of the core insights, the perspectives of someone, exceptionally intelligent on some really big topics.
And hopefully do it in a way that feels accessible, not too overwhelming, because some of these ideas get complex fast.
For sure. Okay, so let's start with something that probably strikes a lot of people first. You hear highest IQ, and then you hear he's living on a farm in Missouri after working as a bouncer.
Yeah, it's definitely a contrast. It makes you ask, why not academia? Why not, some high-powered research position or something?
And Langan addresses this pretty head-on in the interview. He basically says money, well, it just wasn't the main goal for him, ever.
He talks about growing up with financial struggles and finding that the pursuit of knowledge itself was kind of his refuge. And importantly, it was free. You just need books, access to information.
It's a really different way of looking at things compared to how society usually values success, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this sort of lack of interest in conventional success seems tied to some negative experiences he had within the systems themselves. He uses the phrase frozen out of the economic mainstream.
Right, he gives examples, like in college, clashing with professors. There's that story about the calculus instructor.
Yeah, where he felt the instructor was more about authority than actually teaching or, recognizing that Langan might have already grasped the material or even seen beyond it.
And then later, trying for civil service jobs in New York, he felt blocked. He mentions affirmative action specifically, feeling that merit wasn't the deciding factor.
Which leads him to be pretty critical of the whole idea of meritocracy, at least as it played out for him. He felt merit just didn't make a difference in those situations.
And that feeling, of being talented but still feeling like an outsider or questioning the system, I think that's something a lot of you listening might relate to, even on a smaller scale.
Definitely. But the key thing is, leaving college didn't stop him learning. Not at all.
No, he just kept going. He talks about hitting up library sales, used bookstores, just absorbing information from wherever he could find it, even old, outdated textbooks.
And this intellectual drive started really young. He mentions being about 14, working on a ranch, and reading Einstein and Bertrand Russell.
Wow, at 14. And not just reading them, but apparently starting to think about how their ideas might connect.
Exactly. He saw Einstein dealing with reality through geometry, physics, and Russell dealing with it through logic and language. And he thought, maybe these are just two sides of the same coin. They need to be brought together.
And that, essentially, is the birthplace of his big idea, the CTMU, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe.
Right. He describes reality itself as logico-geometric. It's this fusion of the structure of language and logic with the structure of the physical universe.
So CTMU, let's break that down a bit. Cognitive.
That points to the role of mind, theory, language in understanding reality.
Theoretic model.
That's the framework itself, the structure he's proposing.
And universe.
Well, that's what it's all about, right? The whole thing. His claim is that these aren't separate domains. Cognition, theory, the universe, they're all intrinsically linked, distributed throughout reality. It's aiming to be a true theory of everything.
It's incredibly ambitious, trying to formally connect math, logic, physics, and even consciousness.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway for you here is perhaps the inspiration that really deep insights can come from outside the usual channels, from independent study, from making connections others might miss.
Okay, so building on this foundation of the CTMU, the interview moves into some really fundamental territory, like the existence of God.
And Langan is surprisingly direct about this. He flat out says, yes, God exists.
No hedging.
Nope. And for him, God isn't just some external creator. God is the fundamental identity of reality itself.
He used that analogy of Moses in the burning bush, doesn't he? I am that I am.
Exactly. That phrase captures the essence of it for him, pure, self-contained, self-defining identity. That's God.
And the CTMU, his model, is supposed to provide a kind of mathematical or logical structure for this identity.
That's the idea. He claims that when you develop the logical structure for this ultimate identity, the properties that naturally emerge from that structure, well, they align quite closely with how God is described in many major religions.
He mentions Abrahamic faiths, Hinduism, Vedism.
Right, those traditions clearly have a concept of God or a supreme being. But he also suggests links to concepts in, say, Taoism with the Tao, or Buddhism with emptiness or pure consciousness, seeing potential underlying commonalities.
So what are these properties of God, according to Langan and the CTMU? The usual omniscience, omnipotence?
Yes, those two. Omnipresence as well. But crucially, he emphasizes sentience, consciousness, as fundamental to God's nature. God isn't just an abstract principle, God is conscious.
And this allows for a personal relationship.
He believes so. He describes humans as images of God, essentially a result of God mapping aspects of his own consciousness or identity into individual beings.
He also makes a distinction between pantheism and panentheism.
Right. Pantheism says God is the universe, they're identical. Panentheism, which is closer to Langan's view via the CTMU, says the universe is in God, but God is also more than the universe. God encompasses a reality beyond the physical cosmos, including what he calls a processing domain.
So it's not just equating God with rocks and trees.
No, it's much broader. God contains the universe but isn't limited to it. For you listening, this really pushes for a deeper think about what existence itself means, what belief means, beyond maybe the simple definitions we sometimes work with.
Okay, from God to consciousness and free will. These are obviously connected in his framework.
Very much so. He argues consciousness isn't just something humans have. It's fundamental to reality. It exists everywhere, down to the quantum level.
How does that work?
He talks about identity operators at the quantum level, sort of the most basic units of being or selfness. Now, this isn't human-like consciousness, obviously, but a fundamental property of identity existing everywhere.
But human consciousness is still special in some way.
Yes, he distinguishes between this generic, fundamental consciousness and the role human consciousness plays, particularly collectively, in actually determining how events unfold.
And what about free will? Does it exist in this model?
Oh, absolutely. He's a very strong proponent of genuine free will. He argues against deterministic views.
How does he counter determinism?
Well, he gets into quantum field theory. He argues that the idea of reality being built on a fixed grid or manifold of zero-dimensional points, which is a basis for simple cause and effect determinism, is actually paradoxical and incompatible with quantum mechanics.
The manifold paradox.
Yeah. If the points have zero size, the whole thing logically collapses into nothingness, basically. It doesn't hold up as a fundamental description, in his view.
So if simple cause and effect breaks down, what replaces it?
He introduces something called metacausation. It's more complex than A causes B. It involves influences running both forward in time, what he calls retarded causation, the normal kind, and also backward in time.
Backward in time, retrocausation.
Yes, advanced causation or retrocausation. He sees these operating together in a kind of cycle, a conspansive cycle, where reality is constantly being generated and regenerated.
Wow. Okay, so if reality is constantly being recreated, that leaves room
for genuine choice. Free will isn't an illusion in a predetermined clockwork universe. Instead, our choices are part of this ongoing generative process. They actually help shape what reality becomes next.
That's a very empowering perspective, isn't it? It suggests our agency is real and fundamental to how the universe works.
It definitely challenges the more mechanistic or deterministic viewpoints out there.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly, though it's still connected. The interview also touches on the spiritual realm, things like angels and demons.
Yes, Langan expresses a belief in their reality. He sees them as part of this larger conscious universe described by the CTMU.
And he links this to potential dangers, like with certain experiences.
He mentions things like psychedelics, suggesting they might open a kind of gap or channel, potentially exposing someone to influences that aren't necessarily positive, connecting to these non-terminal forms of consciousness, which could include negative entities.
Does he believe in the devil?
He does, seeing the devil or Satan as sort of a necessary antithesis to God within the logic of reality. However, he argues this antithesis lacks inherent coherence or power on its own. It kind of relies on human participation or belief to manifest effects.
He makes a distinction between Satan and Lucifer too, right?
Yeah, drawing on certain traditions, he sees Lucifer more as an exiled angel of light, maybe fulfilling a necessary, albeit perhaps negative, function within our current imperfect phase of reality. It's quite a complex theological point.
And what about the afterlife? Heaven and hell?
He believes consciousness persists after physical death. Where one goes depends on their true nature, their alignment or misalignment with the fundamental identity, which is God.
So hell isn't just a place of external punishment?
Not entirely. He emphasizes the idea of hell being largely self-created, drawing on Milton's line about the mind being its own place. Your internal state, your separation from that divine identity, creates its own form of suffering. He references Dante's Inferno as well.
So the implication for you, the listener, is to really consider the nature of good and evil, and how your own choices and fundamental beliefs might shape not just this life, but potentially what comes after.
It certainly provokes thought about the ultimate consequences of our internal and external actions.
Now, Langan doesn't shy away from more worldly topics either, like society, politics, globalism. We touched on his views on meritocracy earlier.
Right. His personal experience led him to be pretty skeptical. Merit made no difference whatsoever was his takeaway from certain encounters, especially in civil service.
He also talks about conspiracy, not just as a theory, but as a reality of how power often operates.
Yeah, he frames it quite pragmatically. Businesses have trade secrets, governments have classified intelligence. These are forms of conspiracy, coordinating actions in secret for a specific goal. He argues it's naive to think this doesn't happen on a larger geopolitical scale.
Which brings him to globalism. He sees it as a very real force, driven by what he calls globalists.
People, often very wealthy or influential, who he believes are working towards a kind of centralized world control, diminishing national sovereignty.
And national politicians.
Often just puppets, in his view, acting on behalf of these larger globalist interests. He points to organizations like the World Economic Forum and its Young Global Leaders program. He lists names like Trudeau, Macron, Merkel, even Putin initially, he notes.
And how does someone like Trump fit into this picture for Langan?
He suggests Trump's election was partly because he tapped into nationalist sentiments and was seen as less controllable by these globalist forces.
He also expresses concerns about the 2020 election, doesn't he? Without getting into specifics here, he strongly implies he believes there were significant irregularities.
Yes, he does. It's important we state we're reporting his views from the interview, not endorsing them.
Absolutely.
Right.
Politically, he mentions his own journey. He grew up in a more liberal, democratic environment.
Paty says the evolution of the Democratic Party pushed him towards a more strongly defined conservative position, though he's also critical of modern conservatism.
Also,
he feels it's often cuckolded, as he puts it, too afraid to genuinely stand up to liberal or progressive agendas, compromising too easily.
he uses immigration as an example, suggesting that policies often seem disconnected from public opinion and are driven more by these perceived globalist aims, like diluting national identity or providing cheap labor.
And he connects this to the power of technology surveillance, data analysis, media control, enabling what he sees as an oligarchy of the wealthy to exert influence relatively unchecked.
Again, these are strong views. The point for you listening is perhaps to engage critically with ideas about power structures, who holds influence, and what forces might be shaping society, regardless of whether you agree with Langan's specific conclusions.
It's about prompting critical thought on these complex dynamics.
Let's move into science, technology, and some related, maybe more out there topics he discusses. Bill Gates, for instance.
He acknowledges Gates's intellect but questions his focus, particularly on issues like overpopulation, which Langan seems to think is misguided or perhaps a manufactured concern.
What about things like Bitcoin or alternative currencies?
He sees potential there, especially starting locally, as a way to push back against centralized financial control, a way for communities to regain some economic autonomy.
He also revisits the topic of drugs, specifically mind-expanding ones. We mentioned the risks earlier.
Yes, the risk of opening oneself to negative influences, but he also seems to acknowledge they can potentially create a link or opening to non-physical aspects of consciousness because he rejects purely physicalist views of reality. He believes everything has a mental or cognitive component.
This connects to his views on UFOs, right?
It does. He states quite plainly that belief in UFOs or UAPs is widespread within intelligence communities. He doesn't see it as fringe.
And he shares a personal sighting experience.
Yeah, near Lewiston, Montana. He describes seeing a large, silent, motionless, featureless spheroid object just hanging in the sky. A very clear, unambiguous sighting for him.
Then there's the connection he makes between transhumanism and transgenderism. This is likely to be controversial.
It is. He views both movements as stemming from a similar impulse, a desire to escape the perceived constraints of physical or biological reality. He describes this impulse as anti-teleological, meaning against the inherent purpose or design he sees in nature and existence, which he links to God's will.
Again, reporting his perspective here. He also dismisses the idea of uploading consciousness into computers.
Right. His argument is basically, We're already in a kind of self-simulating universe based on consciousness, the CTMU framework. True uploading, he suggests, happens after physical death, based on one's relationship with God, not through technology.
So for you listening, Langan is really challenging conventional boundaries here between science and spirituality, physical and mental, mainstream and fringe. It pushes you to question basic assumptions about reality, technology, and where humanity might be heading.
Definitely stretches the conceptual landscape.
Finally, the interview delves into fundamental values: truth, beauty, meaning. He frames a central choice for humanity.
Between truth, which he equates with God or the ultimate reality principle, and mammon, representing materialism, money, and implicitly the globalist agenda he critiques.
He's quite critical of modern academia in this context.
Very. He calls it an indoctrination factory, pushing what he sees as a false, communistic, atheistic narrative, steering people away from deeper truths.
So where does he suggest people look for wisdom?
He recommends going back to the classics. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Plotinus, and the Neoplatonists, early Christian philosophers like Aquinas and Augustine. He cautions that philosophy after Aquinas started to lean too heavily into dualism, separating mind and matter too rigidly.
What about beauty? Is it just subjective?
Not for Langan. He believes in an objective standard of beauty linked to that concept of teleology, purpose, design, the will of God. Something is beautiful partly because it fulfills its intended nature well.
So he rejects beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Or at least argues that phrase ignores the existence of objective standards. He's critical of modern art that seems to deliberately reject beauty and truth, citing examples like Serrano's Piss Christ as provocative but ultimately empty or destructive.
This ties into his critique of tolerance when taken to extremes.
Yes. He argues that tolerance shouldn't mean accepting things that violate fundamental biological imperatives or harm societal well-being. He brings up examples like Drag Queen Story Hour as something he sees as crossing a line, pushing an agenda that's harmful or inappropriate for children.
He connects back to his personal journey too, moving from a more liberal upbringing to conservatism and developing his own spiritual path that seems quite independent, even if aligned with core Christian principles. He doesn't seem tied to traditional church structures.
No, his focus is very much on the direct understanding and application of these deeper principles.
And ultimately, it all comes down to the search for meaning, doesn't it?
Exactly. He echoes Viktor Frankl, arguing that the search for meaning is humanity's primary motivation, far more fundamental than just pursuing pleasure or power, or even just money.
He sees chasing money alone as ultimately futile, disconnected from that deeper sense of purpose and fulfillment.
Right, so the message for you here seems to be about grounding yourself in fundamental values, truth, beauty, meaning, and seeking a holistic understanding of life that integrates the intellectual, the spiritual, and the practical.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Christopher Langan's thoughts, it's clear his perspective challenges a lot of common assumptions.
Yeah.
About intelligence, about the nature of reality, God, society, the future.
It definitely does. Whether you agree with all, some, or none of his conclusions, engaging with his ideas forces you to examine your own beliefs on these really fundamental questions.
So the final thought for you to take away is this. What part of Langan's complex worldview resonates most with you, even if just as a point of disagreement? And what fundamental question about reality or society or your own existence does this deep dive inspire you to explore further on your own?